Bonjour, Anin, and welcome to the 8th installment of our GLIER TRUS virtual seminar series. My name is Chelsea Salter, and I am a master's student at GLIER in Dr. Chris Weisner's lab at the University of Windsor.
You're on mute, Brittany.
Sorry, and my name is Brittany Dabney. I'm a PhD student in the TRUS program in Dr. Donna Cashian's lab at Wayne State University.
And we are your today's hosts for the panel.
To begin, we'd like to acknowledge that the University of Windsor and Wayne State University sits on the traditional territory of the Three Fires of Confederacy of First Nations, Anishinaabeg, Peoria, Miamia, and Mississauga nations.
We, as the Windsor and Wayne University communities, would like to move beyond acknowledgements, and we would like to not only give our respect to the traditional territory we are on, but also commit to learning and growing, starting with our partnerships and collaborations moving forward.
Today, our panelists will be discussing topics related to their work, as well as providing advice for those interested in careers or collaborations with nonprofit and social enterprises. We as graduate students have prepared a list of questions and topics related to environmental sustainability, career perspectives, research needs of organizations, and how we can facilitate collaboration to solve our most pressing environmental issues. And we're pleased to have with us today a group of panelists that have a unique set of experiences and currently work on a wide range of environmental topics. However, what they share in common is the goal of improving the environment and the communities that they serve. And we are very grateful that they are joining us today to share their perspectives. So if everybody can turn on their camera and give a wave to our panelists.
Okay, so as part of the Zoom ground rules, everyone should already be on mute, and now you can turn your video off. So please confirm that and turn your video off now if it's not already off. Your chat facilitators today are Hector and Savannah, so please send your questions to them and they will pass them on to myself and Brittany for the Q&A portion of the panel. This talk will be recorded and posted online at a later date, and the recording's already started, so that's great. So the format of the panel goes on as follows. We will introduce the speakers and they will tell us a little bit more about themselves and their organization, and we will have an open discussion for about an hour. Everyone is encouraged to stay for the second half where we'll be taking questions from the audience. So before we begin, I would just like to announce that our next panel, titled Environmental Solutions to Industrial Challenges, will be taking place on Friday, February 26th. So we hope that you can join us for this industry-based career panel. For anyone who missed our previous seminars in our traditional ecological knowledge panel, we now have launched our YouTube channel, which will be posted in the chat so you can watch our entire seminar series, which focuses on the topic of transformative change in environmental sustainability.
So to begin, me and Chelsea will now introduce each of our panelists, starting with Donna Givens, followed by Pauline Gerrard, Dr. Jalonne White-Newsome, Dr. Katie Stammler, and Dr. Patrick Doran. As a follow-up to your introductions, could you please describe your organization, any additional details about your organization, some of its main objectives, and if you'd like to share any projects that you're currently working on. And we'll have a slide to help sort of remind. We'll have a slide to remind you what the questions are. So first, we'll start with Donna Givens, who is President and CEO of Eastside Community Network on the east side of Detroit. The Eastside Community Network is a nonprofit focused on using a multifaceted approach to sustainable redevelopment of communities through economics, education, and the environment. Among several initiatives at ECN is the redevelopment or repurposing of land into blue-green infrastructure and nature areas. She has over 30 years of experience working in the nonprofit sector and being a prominent community leader who has served on the boards of several other nonprofits here in Detroit. She has a Master's of Educational Leadership from Wayne State University, a Bachelor's of Arts in Political Science from the University of Michigan, and a Certificate of Completion from the Harvard University Summer Leadership Institute.
Hi.
So the first question is, could you describe your organization a little bit more and any potential projects that you're working on?
Yeah, so we believe in people-centered change. And so our focus is on building the capacity of people inside of our community to make their own decisions and to drive their own processes for change. We started out in the environmental justice arena looking at green infrastructure because it was about the land. And with the amount of blight and devastation caused by the Great Recession, there were big questions about how do we deal with vacancy? What do we do about abandonment? And an opportunity came to our attention to really look at the opportunity to leverage vacant land to manage green stormwater infrastructure. And so that's where we started. Over time, we have gotten more deeply into climate equity issues. So you don't just look at water management, but you've got to look at the air. You've got to look at the what's happening with our soils and how climate health impacts people's overall health and well-being. We have flooding in people's basements. We have sewage backups and other aspects of just environmental neglect going on in our community. Every time there's demolition, some people cheer, but you also have the threat of lead and asbestos, being released into the air and the soil. And so we're looking more broadly at environmental issues as they impact the well-being of people inside of our community. And in so doing, actually with another panelist, Dr. Jalonne, we got into the climate health equity space in trying to figure out how to change policy and look at the way policies contribute to the climate health equity issues. It's not just a person-to-person thing, but the policies that drive inequity in our community. We have about 20 staff people. We also have youth programs and community economic development, and we lead an initiative called the Lower Eastside Action Plan Coalition, which is comprised of about 38 organizations, all working with us on a 15 square mile community in a 15 square mile area to try to bring about change.
Thank you, Donna, for that introduction. So our next panelist is Pauline Gerrard, who is the Deputy Director of IISD Experimental Lakes Area, the world's living laboratory. At IISD ELA, she leads the education and outreach program, engaging the general public in freshwater science in Canada and around the world. Pauline's educational background is in environmental science and ecology, and she has extensive experience in program management and environmental management in both Canada and Asia. From 2001 to 2010, Pauline worked for the World Wildlife Fund for Nature in Laos as a program manager and leading the project Wastewater Treatment through Effective Wetland Restoration of that Luang Marsh. Pauline is passionate about the value of science communication and loves to spend her time looking for bugs in ponds and wetlands. I'll pass it on to you now, Pauline.
Great, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect. Yeah, the International Institute for Sustainable Development and our kind of body of work around the experimental lakes area. We have a research station in Northwestern Ontario, Canada, so a remote part of the boreal forest. And we do whole ecosystem research on small boreal lakes to try and understand the impacts that humans are having on freshwater systems. And we use that science to feed back into our broader program to make recommendations on policy and decision-making by governments and industry about what they're doing related to our freshwater. And like you heard from my kind of bio, I have a lot of experience with a wide variety of different not-for-profits and believe strongly in the impacts that not-for-profits can have really around the world in all different kinds of sectors, but obviously the environment sector that I'm in specifically. And I believe strongly that there's a need for not-for-profits to partner with academics, with government, with private people that care about the world around them, and they can really help move the bar forward on making the world a better place.
Well, thank you, Pauline, for your introduction. And now we'll move on to Dr. Jalonne White-Newsome, who is CEO and founder of Empowering a Green Environment and Economy, LLC, a strategic consultancy working to transform communities through people-centered solutions. Her expertise crosses the areas of climate change, public health, and racial equity. Jalonne recently transitioned from her role as Senior Program Officer at the Kresge Foundation, leading the Environment Program's grant portfolio on climate resilience and equitable water systems. Before joining Kresge, she served as Director of Federal Policy at We Act for Environmental Justice. She also worked in state government, private industry, and academia. A proud Detroit native, she earned her PhD in environmental health sciences from the University of Michigan School of Public Health, a master's degree in environmental engineering from Southern Methodist University, and a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from Northwestern University. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Brittany, for the kind introduction. And I definitely want to start out by acknowledging the land that I am on today, the land of the Potawatomi in West Bloomfield, Michigan. And Donna, it's so good to see you as well and other familiar faces. So as of February 1st, I became the CEO and founder of my own company, Empowering a Green Environment and Economy. And what I will say is that we are a consulting firm, but really focused on, again, transforming communities by building people-centered solutions and keeping people at the center of everything we do. And so really we provide strategy support, research, facilitation, training. But really what I like to say is we try and work with institutions to get rid of the excuses, to get rid of the barriers, to get rid of the reasons as to why you can't move, change, and implement transformative policy and strategy that will, one, advance racial equity, two, disrupt systems that are not serving people, and three, again, just try and again, make sure that we're giving communities what they need to adapt to the changes due to climate change and other natural stressors. And so what I will say that most of my work now has been with government clients, my first being in British Columbia and Canada, which is exciting, and also working with the state of Michigan and a couple of professional societies. And what I'm really excited about is, you know, again, the opportunity to help folks operationalize equity in whatever they're doing. So whether you're providing water services or waste services or air quality services, what does it mean to actually advance racial equity in those spaces? As well as if you're a practitioner and you're on the ground every day, what does that mean to advance equity in your practice and do that in a way that makes your environment, again, sustainable and healthy for everyone? So glad to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Jalonne. Moving on to our next panelist, we have Dr. Katie Stammler, Water Quality Scientist and Source Water Protection Project Manager at Essex Region Conservation Authority. Dr. Stammler completed her Bachelor of Science in 2003 at the University of Windsor and her Master of Science in 2005 at the University of Guelph, where she studied fish assemblages and agricultural drains. She completed her PhD at the University of Western Ontario in 2011, where she examined the extent, characteristics, and effect of stream burial in southwestern Ontario. She was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Waterloo, studying long-term trends in stream water quality across all land use types. She has been with the Essex Region Conservation Authority as a water quality scientist and source water protection project manager since 2014. Locally raised in Windsor, Dr. Stammler is passionate about making a difference in our corner of the world through research, conservation, education, and mentoring the next generation of conservationists. Welcome to Dr. Stammler.
Thank you, Chelsea. So the Essex Region Conservation Authority is one of 36 conservation authorities in the province. We are watershed-based organizations. They're called sort of quasi-governmental, so we're a product of the municipal government and provincial government, and we're governed under the Conservation Authorities Act, which changes from time to time and governs how we do our work and what we're allowed to do. 90% of Ontarians live in a watershed that's managed by a conservation authority. The first one was established in 1946, and the Essex Region Conservation Authority, which we call ERCA, was one of the last to be established in 1973. And our role as conservation authorities is to manage natural resources of our regions, except for oil and gas. And we do that in partnership with municipalities and the province. We're a very diverse organization with many different professionals, and it's a really cool place to work where everybody there is highly educated in a very different field and has a very unique aspect that they bring to the table. We have botanists and biologists, geographers, IT specialists, communication specialists, engineers, educators, all sorts of different professions that we get to work with and have the pleasure of learning from each other all the time. The research that I'm mostly directly involved with is related mostly to Lake Erie, which you can see a couple different forms behind me, and harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie, and specifically phosphorus management. So we do a lot of monitoring of all of our local water courses. We also are participants in some broader research projects across the province. And we partner with some different researchers. And I also have my adjunct status at GLIER, so I have a couple graduate students whose committees I get to be on as well.
Brittany, you're on mute again.
Sorry. And finally we have Dr. Patrick Doran, who is the Associate State Director in Michigan. He oversees conservation strategies for the Nature Conservancy's work in Michigan, with contributions throughout the Great Lakes region, North America, and globally. Under his leadership, staff of over 30 conservation professionals focus on strategies that address protected areas establishment and management, sustainable forestry and agriculture, coastal management, invasive species, fisheries, and aquatic connectivity restoration, urban conservation, climate change adaptation, and underlying measures of success monitoring and information management. Patrick earned his PhD in ecology from Dartmouth College, where he studied forest bird populations at the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Patrick also holds degrees from Indiana University and Villanova University. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. First, I'd just like to thank you and thank the panel organizers, Chelsea and Brittany and Hector and Savannah, kind of behind the scenes right now. I just really appreciate the kind of thought and care in assembling a panel that brings a variety of perspectives. A few years ago, I adopted a panel pledge to really only participate in panels that represent a diversity of viewpoints, and you all made it very easy with your thoughtfulness and care in designing that. So thank you very much. And say hello to all my fellow panelists. I know some of you well, some of you cross paths with, so thank you. And it really is quite an honor to be here today and speak alongside you. So I work for the Nature Conservancy. We are a global conservation organization, one of the largest in the world. We're between 4,000 and 5,000 employees, 80 different countries around the world. So we have quite a scope and vision. We do see a vision, our mission to conserve the lands and waters in which all life depends, and all life is both people and nature. We envision a world where the diversity of life thrives and people act to conserve nature, not only for its own sake, but for the ability of nature to fulfill the needs, fill our individual needs and enrich our lives. So I think, Katie mentioned, this is a fun organization to work with, just like she mentioned, her organization. It's a fun, we have a variety of folks that come from all different kinds of expertise, kind of traditional ecologists to finance, people with finance expertise and policy expertise, and and some wonderful scientists and very dynamic project managers. So it's an excellent and fun and dynamic place to work. My job is with our Michigan chapter. So even though we're a global organization, we really touch the ground in various states and country programs. And I get to oversee our work here, both in Michigan and across the Great Lakes. And, you know, I think of my job as a strategist almost. I kind of have my fingers in all those different strategies, from our Healthy Cities work in Detroit to preserves in places just north of Toledo, like Erie Marsh, all the way through the agricultural lands of Saginaw Bay, Saginaw Valley area, to the forests of the Upper Peninsula, really thinking holistically about how this entire system provides for nature and people. I'm going to leave it there. Again, thank you, and I'm really looking forward to diving into some of these questions.
All right, thank you to all our panelists for their introductions. We'll now move on to some other panel questions that we have prepared. And just as a reminder to our audience that if you have any questions, please send them to our chat facilitators, Hector and Savannah. So we're going to start out with a very general question. What do you think is the role of nonprofits and social enterprises in addressing environmental sustainability? And just as a follow-up question to that, in your opinion, what are the most pressing environmental issues that we must address in the coming years? And anyone can speak first.
I guess I'll start. So I think one of the things that I appreciate about working in a not-for-profit and a conservation authority sort of crosses a lot of boundaries. Sometimes we do, you know, we're funded by the government, but we're not, we don't have to adhere to the same communications lockdowns sometimes that can happen at a government level. So I think one of the important things that we get to do is communicate more freely, and to actually be on the ground, local, with the people that are working on these things. So I think that to me is one of our greatest benefits to being these sort of smaller nonprofit type organizations. So that's what I'll say about our role, and I'll hold off on the second part.
Maybe I'll just add to that. I think the other thing that nonprofits bring to the table is the ability to be really nimble. We don't have big bureaucracies generally around us, so it's easy to kind of change stream. If you, like all the nonprofits I've been part of, we've had a bit of the attitude where if you can find the funding and explain why it's important, then just try, go for it, see what you can do. And that's definitely not the case within sort of governments and larger industry. And on the second question, I mean, I would say hands down, climate change is the challenge that is the biggest pressing kind of environmental challenge of our day. And I mean, it's a social challenge as well. There's lots of issues about climate change.
I think that our systems are set up to favor the needs and priorities of corporations, and also, you know, just an existing way of being, which allows for resource depletion and pollution. And so if we are going to address that, especially from the perspective of environmental justice, then the nonprofits end up being an extension of democracy, where we build power in the voices and the needs and expression of people, especially those who are most harmed. And so in the way that we engage in the work, I absolutely agree that global climate change is an issue. It's the biggest concern. But I think we also have to look at the overall way that we manage sustainability, where we end up depleting natural resources over a short term, and also and then poisoning natural resources in places where people who have less power and value to the social structure of our world really live. So I think in the United States, it means that we've got to be engaged and we've got to connect climate equity, climate preservation to environmental justice. You can't disconnect those and end up with a just outcome.
Yeah, I totally agree with what everyone else has said, and I would only add a couple of dimensions. I think, you know, again, having kind of been in the nonprofit and now in the social enterprise, the most important thing is just the different perspectives that nonprofits and social enterprises bring. Because again, if we're talking about some really crazy issues like climate, like dealing with systemic racism, it takes all the different perspectives. First, to appreciate and acknowledge the perspectives, but also as we talk about solutions. And I think you cannot get to a solution that is going to be more helpful and harmful without making sure that we have all voices and perspectives in the room. So I think that is the critical role that both play in the sustainability space. But I also want to say that to the most critical environmental issue, I think definitely climate change, but I would say maybe another issue in that space is accountability. The fact that we have allowed corporations, governmental entities, and anyone else to kind of do this damage to our society, to our people. And so until we make accountability a critical issue, we will continue to go down the same path, which is not good. So I think that is what I have been over the past 20 years. It's like no one, you know, seems to be accountable to anyone, and we need to change that.
I held off on answering because the note I made for myself was like, this is not going to be a popular answer because people like climate change, yes, is the biggest issue, but I'm really pleased to hear both Donna and Jalonne speaking about this. What I wrote down as what I think are the biggest environmental issues is greed, apathy, and hopelessness, and a lack of empathy. And it comes down to people and how we treat the environment. In all these different ways so that's sort of stuff that I'm trying to grapple with is how do we, and I love this idea of people-driven change and getting people to care more about it, because yes, we know these environmental issues are real, but how do we overcome these other bigger societal problems that are outside of science?
I'd just quickly add, I think that yes to everything. I think this, what can nonprofits do, and why do I choose to work with, is one thing I think is that flexibility that was already mentioned, but just working in a place like that we all work, it's mission driven, and that's important to the people that work there. And you see everybody in that organization pointed in the same direction. They're bringing that diversity of skills and viewpoints that Jalonne mentioned, but they're all focused in the same direction. And that's very empowering when you work in a place like that. And with all of our organizations, having that, as somebody, I think Donna mentioned, the creativity, the flexibility, the dynamic nature of it, but that's all in the common direction of your organization. So that's very powerful when you have a full organization pointing in the same direction. It may not necessarily be true in a business or in a university in academic settings. So that's one unique element. We need all those perspectives, but that's really what I do enjoy. I absolutely climate change, but one time I did hear somebody provocatively say, you know, yes, climate change, but climate's not the only game in town. We still have some fundamental issues of losing nature, losing water quality, losing habitat, losing the ability to walk out your door wherever you live and be tied to nature. So it's that, I mean, it's maybe two sides of that same coin with the climate change pressure, but if we don't have the things we care about on the other side of that climate arrow, or whatever you want to count, climate threat, it's an empty thing. So, and I'd say on that nature side, then it's the appreciation of nature and the understanding of nature, and not realization that not everybody has the same relationship to nature. So valuing nature in the daily lives, I think, is another issue. Whether it's our business or individual abilities, it is another huge issue that I see, the loss of value of nature.
So thank you everyone for your answers. And I guess as a follow-up to that, when we talk about, because a lot of you all's work are very people-centered. So in order to address these environmental issues, who do you really have to convince? Is it the people that aren't impacted by climate change or these environmental issues, or who feel like they aren't impacted? Or is it politicians? Like, who do you have to convince in order to solve these very complex environmental issues?
I mean, I think people know how they know what the impacts of the environment are. People know when they can't breathe. People know when they're being hospitalized. People know when their children are experiencing issues. I think what people don't necessarily understand is the reason why. People may know their basement is flooding without understanding why it's happening, or the streets are flooding without understanding why it's happening. So I think community education is a big part of the puzzle. And then part of it is also us being willing to learn from the community, because there are things that people also know that we don't listen to. In Flint, when you had the Flint water crisis, people knew the water was brown, people knew it smelled, people knew that things were wrong, but people weren't listening to them. How many people in our community are expressing concerns and not being heard? And then because they are not acting on an environmental agenda, we assume that's because they don't care. So I think the first thing to do is to engage with the community and really figure out what people do know and care about, and learn as well as teach. But I think that the real issue is the policies that govern how we manage air, how we manage water, all of those things are beyond the control of people. So I might be able to make an individual decision to get a low flush toilet or take a shorter shower, but that is not going to fix what's broken here. The societal, the policy issues around what's broken, it's not me buying Nestle water or Aquafina or whatever. It is the fact that Nestle is tapping into that water source. How do we get beyond the people to the power of policy and help bring people in the same direction so that people can be working together? If we're coal burning plants, everything like that, we know we need renewable energy whenever we have a blackout or a brownout. We just don't know what the options are. And so I feel like the challenge is really honoring the intelligence and capacity of people to support logical change, but also making a shared demand on government and on those people in power to hold corporate America accountable, to hold banks accountable, and the people who really control the levers of power in our society.
Yeah, I would, that's so elegantly said. And what we're dealing with in Ontario right now, we have a lot of changes that are coming from our provincial government that are changing how we do things. So I would really, what's important is that we empower citizens to understand what's happening, and that we empower them to understand that it's their voice that makes a difference. Our politicians respond to votes. So if the people are upset about the policies that are in place, we need people talking about that, and we need people pressuring their elected officials to change policy, because if we can't change those policies, then we can't fix the bigger problems. And you're right. Like, it's the number one question we hear anytime I'm sure any of us gives a presentation. What's one thing that I as an individual can do? And I found an encyclopedia in my house from like the 70s that had, what we can do about climate change. And it's the same things that we say now: turn your temperature down, put a sweater on, take shorter showers, do these things, right? We know the individual actions that we can take, but we need our governments to make these bigger policy changes, but that's driven by the individuals and by the power of the public acting together.
If I could just really respond a little bit to that. Politicians can respond to votes, but in the case of places like Flint, the people's voting power was completely dismantled, and people in other communities consented to let that happen to some extent. I mean, there were some outcries. We did overturn the first emergency manager law, but there was emergency management happening in communities long before then in Detroit with the bankruptcy. And we didn't have allies. We didn't have other communities saying, no, this is wrong. So to a certain extent, we've also got to educate those people who don't understand their impact and don't understand that you can't poison water in my community without poisoning water in your community. Mm-hmm. Poison air in my community moves into your community. And so we have to really look at our shared well-being, because people without political power and influence can be supported by people who have more.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think change comes and happens from a variety of different levers. And although it's not the easy answer as a not-for-profit, if you're pushing for change, you need to be trying to push multiple levers at one time. And so that's working with individuals and community members to build that common understanding, but also at the same time working with politicians and decision makers and policymakers. At the Experimental Lakes area, we do science with the end goal of trying to facilitate better decision making around fresh water. And a few years ago, we did a study to look at, like, okay, what are the direct linkages between science and policy making? What are examples of where science has had a direct impact on better policy making, and how can we then think about our own work to make that policy change? And what we found is that the kind of biggest factor that influences that direct connection is legitimacy of the research. And so, and what that meant was multiple different perspectives understood and agreed with that science and that research. And so now what we do is we try and involve multiple different perspectives and partners in all of our work. And so right now we have a big study looking at oil and the impacts of oil spills in fresh water and how best to clean those up. And we have industry partners, government partners, academic partners, and then we're an NGO. And we really think that by getting all of those groups, even though it was really hard at the beginning because everybody had to get on the table and agree on like a methodology and the research design, the long term is that hopefully we'll make recommendations for industry standard cleanups, for government policy on limits, and the general public hopefully will kind of understand the value of some of those decisions because we've involved as many groups as possible right from the beginning.
Yeah, I so appreciate that. So there's a couple of things, a lot going on in my head. So hopefully this will be somewhat eloquent, but it might be real jagged. So I remember spending a lot of time lobbying on Capitol Hill in DC. And what I was so shocked by was really the lack of knowledge that these policymakers had around environmental issues, justice issues, human rights issues. It's like, you know, you have to make sure that these folks that have power and the ability to create policy and regulate are actually educated, and not just educated by the folks with the dollar signs, but by, again, those folks that have lived and been, unfortunately, the victims of multiple environmental insults and injustices. So one, yes, it's definitely, you know, kind of preparing our communities to understand the issues that they're dealing with and why, but it's also these folks that are in power that need that education as well from good sources. The second piece is around connecting the dots. Like, you know, again, so many folks, I think, and this is, I can't remember who said this, but I feel like sometimes, you know, we don't connect like what we're seeing to the actual source. And I think getting folks to understand that this is not just, you know, this climate change or whatever, it's not just this thing that happened. The Flint water crisis didn't just happen. There's so many underlying systemic shakiness in our systemic systems that that created this problem that erupted into this one outcome. But really getting folks to understand that it's not just anecdotal, it's not just something that it was a coincidence. The system was set up to fail certain people, low-income communities and communities of color. So how can we begin to connect those dots and make that clear, the causal pathway for folks that have power? The third thing that I want to share is really, how do we begin to develop a pipeline of leadership that is, the, you know, again, coming from community, coming from, again, lived experience that can then be put in these positions of power so they can begin to shape the policies and the regulations. And we're seeing some of that in this current administration, which is great, but how do we begin to do that on a local level? Because I feel like in many ways, that is where the rubber hits the road, because you can have all the wonderful regulations you want, you can have all the wonderful policies, we have plenty of them, but there are still people that are dying, that are not being able to live at their fullest potential because these policies and regulations have never been enough. So again, how do we begin to shape that pipeline of folks that can change that and break these systems that aren't working for anyone?
Just real quick, again, the dot connecting, I met a colleague maybe 10 years ago, and she had on her card Chief Dot Connector. That was her title. And I think you know, I think Pauline said it, and Katie said it, and Jalonne said it, and Donna said it too. There's this, I think it maybe foreshadows one of the questions come later. There's this systems thinking, and the levers, the dots, the interconnections of all these entities, wherever the power may lay, wherever the talent may lay, wherever the ideas may lay. It's seeing all those things in the system in which they're presenting. Some of us are trained maybe a bit too analytically, and we think very linearly. If we do this, then we get this. But we live in a really complex system. If we pull this lever over here, you don't know what's going to happen. So then I think that leans to this maybe a different style. Donna or Jalonne mentioned the accountability. A different style of testing and probing and asking questions, and maybe being a touch more dynamic. You need the constant pressure and the constant attention and the constant focus. But these are all very complex systems. So figuring out those important levers, as Pauline mentioned, and trying and tweaking them. And those may hit business, they may hit government, they may hit policy, they may hit the people closest to the land and the water too.
I mean, I think that we also have to examine the role of science, and whether or not science is even respected in decision making, and who has the power and who benefits from the systems as they are. As people are benefiting, people benefited from the from every environmental act of destruction. Somebody's benefiting, if only in the short term. And so I think that understanding the problem and changing the behavior or changing the system are two separate things. One involves research, collaborative, whatever, people-driven research, as well as other types of research. And the other one involves some type of fight. And the question is, are we willing to fight for the systems or systems change? Or are we powerless, we'll just throw up our hands and say, we have no ability to change how things are?
I don't know about you guys, but I feel like I fight all the time.
Right.
Just always have your boxing gloves on.
Right. But sometimes you're fighting by yourself. There are not enough people fighting with you. And that's the problem. I think that actually goes into the collaboration number 3,
Yeah, just so since we've kind of already touched on collaboration a little bit and like some strategies, does anybody have anything specific to say to that? How do we facilitate collaborations between various organizations that may, whether it's between nonprofits or for-profits or even academia or government?
I'll say that I think we've come a long way with this, and you see that in Canada with our NSERC grants, with our major funder for research. They're requiring these partnerships and things. So we're seeing a lot more of this collaborative work, and a lot of the projects that we're part of, there will be a single organization that maybe holds the funding that then delivers it to other people, and they're acting as sort of a main hub. So we're seeing it start to happen. So I don't necessarily have anything to say about how we make it better, because I'm seeing it happen, and it seems to be working in a good way.
I guess I'll just say maybe the opposite. What are the drivers of non-successful collaborations? And I think one of the things that I've seen and witnessed is really when power takes over the room, like particularly if you're talking about government entities and community, and it's just like always this power thing that happens where there's not really a collaboration. It's just, okay, this is what we're going to do and deal with it. So really understanding what that sharing of power means, that when we all come to this table, we are all equal. And so really understanding what power means in collaborations. And then, I would say how people work together. And I'm sure a lot of you have created like ways you're working together, or, kind of memorandums of understanding or things of that nature, but really having like this social contract as you bring these very diverse entities together that come with these different perspectives and levels of experience, again, you know, I think is super important. So it's not just making sure folks are in the room, but it's acknowledging the power play that's in the room and putting it on the table, but also making sure that how we work together, it's codified and it's something that we all agree on. So I've found those are ways that we can get past these barriers that make it hard to collaborate, because collaborate is not easy. And as a funder before, just giving folks some money doesn't mean that they are going to come together and actually collaborate. So how you build that community and the effort you put into that is super important as well.
If I could, it's just like I just think about this question and think about where I have failed on projects at times. To me, there's this call it a curse of territoriality or competitiveness, and some of it's holding on to a power, but some of it's holding on to the ideas and the worries about being underappreciated or not credited or not valued. So there's this, and again, what I don't know, I don't understand all the drivers, but it is this territoriality. And if people are walking into the room with their muscles tightened and the way they sit in the chair, that it's kind of a little bit, they're not leaning into the conversation. So there is that, and I again don't understand why that's always present. I do understand some of the drivers behind that, but you never know in any one instance. So on the flip side of that, I think the strategy, people still do need credit. They still need their ideas acknowledged, and they still are bringing something unique to the table. So that having that be celebrated. So I don't know how to deal with this flip sides of these coins, this competitiveness and territoriality on one side, but the needs to acknowledge that. I read a blog and I tried to find it this morning. I forget what it was, but it was an article talking about new business models and just the openness of sharing data and sharing information, and that the secret sauce of the organization is what they do with that information, but having the information available, I think Don said, the science, having that trusted information available is so valuable to me, coming from my science background. So I'm just trying to navigate all those competitiveness, territoriality, but freedom of information is just a tough space.
You know, whenever we apply for a grant, not every time, but a whole lot of times people say, what makes you better than other people in this space? So there's this scarcity mentality and this feeling that you have to be better than other people in order to be effective at all. And everybody wants to, because there's this absolute fear of losing voice and losing power. And I think that the scarcity mentality that has been allowed to be present in our space, this austerity construct, is something that really happens for people who are fighting for people. People with money don't think in austere terms at all. It's like, wow, you know, let's just get bigger and bigger and bigger, but we're just trying not to disappear in a lot of instances. So I think that it's really a partnership between the community and the funding community to let the funding community understand to some extent how some practices are harmful. I think that, you know, another issue is mistrust, because you're always in that fighting mode. And when you're always in the fighting mode, you have to be in a supportive mode if you're going to bring somebody else in. And who is the enemy? This person likes this person, therefore I can't trust them because I heard they were at this meeting, or 10 years ago they did this, therefore they're part of the enemy. And we spend so much time figuring out who to dislike and trying to keep our enemies straight from our friends, we're missing the point. Our enemy has to be the system. It has to be the problem. People change. Somebody may have made a mistake and not understood something 5 years ago or 5 months ago, and now they get it. Can they be your friend now? Can you work with them now? Or will they forever be that person who messed up? You know, and so I think generosity of spirit, I think that we have to get to a point where we understand that we really are stronger together and we need each other to be successful. It means letting go of some of this stuff.
I'll just say an amen to that, Donna.
All right, that was a really good discussion. We're gonna try to change gears a little bit. Our next question is more about we touched on it a little bit, but just to describe your educational and career pathways and how it led to where you are now, in addition to any advice that you can offer to graduate students who are sitting here listening and wanting to be in a nonprofit or a social enterprise in the future.
I have a couple things to say, I think, about that. So my own career path was, I don't know if it was traditional or not, probably, maybe not. I have a master's degree in environmental science, and then I decided I wanted to do international work. So I ended up going overseas and working in Southeast Asia in Laos, starting as a volunteer, and then getting on with the World Wildlife Fund. My partner and I at the time went with a 2-year plan, and we ended up staying for 10 years and did like really very, very satisfying, interesting conservation work over there. Had 2 kids, decided we wanted our kids to know what it was like to have to wear boots in the winter and build a snowman, and so moved home and ended up getting on with a not-for-profit here in Canada with the International Institute for Sustainable Development. I think the big lesson, 2 things that I could say for grad students that are kind of looking at their own lives and opportunities and thinking about what they want to do. The first one is there's really great jobs in not-for-profits. I think that there are people that sort of think about nonprofits as advocacy-based organizations, which they are, but don't sort of think about the spectrum of opportunities that are there. And I think it might have been Katie in her introduction that said that she works with, a whole variety of IT specialists, scientists, researchers, communication specialists. That's absolutely been my experience. And yeah, the jobs and positions are wide and varied and interesting. So don't overlook not-for-profits in your kind of job search, because there's a lot of opportunities there, and there's a lot of super diverse nonprofits out there. The other thing that I'll say in terms of advice is, I think that if I look at my own career path, the biggest thing that led me to where I am today is that I grabbed hold of opportunities that were presented to me. So when people said, hey, do you want to try this project? Even though I was terrified, I can think of a few times where I was like, no way, like I can't do that. I don't have the experience. I don't have the whatever, but somebody believed in me enough to offer it to me. So I said, sure, I'll try it. Like, these are my concerns, but yeah, if you think that I can do it, I'm going to try. And saying yes to opportunities that were put in front of me led to, a really, really interesting and diverse career. And so even if you're afraid that you can't do it, you probably can. And so take advantage of opportunities that you get presented, because you never know where they're going to lead.
I'll give a real short history of my career. I'm more of a traditional ecologist, kind of traditional grad school training and all those things, and bounced. One thing I did do is kind of move back and forth across the U.S. a couple times. I'll just kind of skip to kind of some things learned. I guess I gave a talk before, and I call these the 4 C's. I think, well, first is kind of the 2-sided coin of content and communications. I mean, I think everything you've seen on this panel, every individual, they know their stuff. You've got to know your stuff. You can't do the fake it till I make it kind of thing. The people here know the content in a rich, deep manner. And so you have to and dive into your content and enjoy it. And that's why, to me, I want to be in a mission-driven place, because I want to love the work that I do. You have to be able to communicate. You have to, because if you have the wonderful ideas, but you can't get them out, or you can't find somebody to help you get them out. So finding some way of communicating those ideas eloquently, humor, seriousness, whatever it takes, the right tone for the right situation. So that content and communications are essential. The other 2 C's for me are kind of the curiosity and a little bit of crazy too. And I think that Pauline just said the curiosity, and you're maybe both curious and crazy. When someone's saying, let's go to another country, and you're like, are you serious? I don't speak the language. I don't know the culture, but you know what? Jump into it. I love the moments when a staff person or a colleague comes to my table or calls me on Zoom now and says, look at this graph, look at this idea. We don't have to direct each other all the time. Let that curiosity, hopefully it's not wasting too much of your time at home when you're with your family or loved ones, but bring something new to the table and just try it out. And it is fine if it's a little crazy. Push the envelope. And I think that gets back to what can nonprofits do earlier. We can push the envelopes a little bit. We can bring ideas in from other sectors. So those are the things. Very basic. I mean, I wish I knew more about finance. I wish I knew more statistics. I wish I knew how the policy gets done. And I wish I knew how to manage a project. So it's like, those are the hard skills. Dang, I wish I would have known more than that, than simply being in the colleges. So I'll stop there.
I look at the field as being broad and having many entry points. And so my pathway actually makes no sense if you're just looking at it from a, logical sequenced process. I graduated with an undergraduate degree in political science. I had probably enough to get a minor in biology and also in African-American studies. I was a late, major change. I started out in biology and I switched to political science when I realized I wasn't going to medical school. So I had a whole lot of learning, in different fields, but my first job was in HIV/AIDS prevention. And that was kind of public health and kind of social work mixed in. And since then, I've just sort of moved from place to place as opportunity has taken me and learned a lot of things along the way. What I'll say is that environmental sustainability is not just for people who are environmental scientists or people who study that. It really should be integrated in everything we do. When we look at, finance, we have to look at finance. When we look at politics, we should be looking at politics. Social work, we should be looking at social work with an idea of how do we sustain the inclusive social well-being of people in our world, and also how do we manage our resources in an equitable fashion. And so I think there's things that you're going to learn in school, there's things you're going to learn on your job, and whatever road you take, you're going to have to learn something else. If you study environmental science, you might need to learn a little bit about politics and people. You may need to learn something about the social history and ethnic history of the people that you're working with. If you study, what I studied, which was more people-centered, you're going to have to learn something about the science. And you may not be the expert when it comes to the science. So when you come together in collaboration, your role is going to be different than somebody who has studied the scientific aspects of the job. But I would say that in this world, people start in one place in their career and frequently end up in very different places. So I don't think that you have to worry about a linear fashion or a linear place to get somewhere. If I wanted to prepare, I probably would have taken more classes in some of the environmental sciences. I was really focused on biology, but all roads kind of can lead to a shared place, not the same place, but a shared place where we're all in this together.
And my career path was very linear. I did my undergrad. I did a co-op program at the University of Windsor. I did one of my co-ops with a conservation authority. The work I did there led to my master's degree. My master's work led directly to my PhD work. PhD work led directly to my postdoc work. I'm listening to all of this, and I'm one of the things that I'm trying to be aware of is my own privilege in that ability to have that very linear trajectory. Certainly didn't end up where I thought I was going to be. So I will say, be willing to walk through the doors that are open for you. If I had, at one point, I didn't think I was going to do a PhD. I remember saying to my mom, I want a job, not a career. But that was sort of the direction I ended up going in, and I'm very glad that I did. And I certainly learned how to think critically. One of the things I think is very important is learning how to listen to people, and the work that I did never do straight science work. It was, I always worked in agricultural areas. So having to, as a city girl, having to learn about farming practices and why decisions are made on a farm the way that they are, and the level of decision making that happens there, and a recognition of what that group of people has to do, and how that aligns with the environment, and that we can't always expect people to make these decisions without consequence to their own bottom line. So I would say that listening is very important skill to have. Building your connections anytime that you're going to a workshop, anytime that you are going anywhere, making sure that you're active and that you're listening and connecting to people that you think are interesting, going outside of what you do. So in my PhD, I worked on fish, but I was consistently going to sessions at conferences that were about nutrient cycling in streams. And that ended up being where my career has led, is more into nutrients, even though that's not my background. Believing in yourself is humongous. Having that confidence. If nobody said it to you already, we all have had imposter syndrome. We've all believed that we don't belong where we are. Know that you do. Know that you are working hard and that you will have earned your seat at the table. And that's been so key for me in my career, is to accept that I have earned my seat at the table. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it there. So yeah.
Yeah, there's so much great advice. And I would just say my path has been super circuitous. In 5th grade, when I remember I started doing science fair projects, my goal was to become the leader of the EPA. Even at 5th grade, it was like, this is my goal. And so I had always loved science, and I had great teachers through high school, proud product of Renaissance High School in Detroit. And they really created that space for me to love science, but also I love to write. And so I think my path was, I knew I would kind of be in this kind of science environmental area, but the way I grew up really instilled this value of people and taking care of people. I come from a family of social servants, and that I knew that was going to be threaded in there. So I guess even though my intention was to be a chemical engineer and work for 40 years and retire and then start my own magazine, that did not happen. And I'm not going to go through, the bio again, but I've been probably in pretty much every sector possible. But what I will say is, as you think about your career and whatever it is that you are passionate about it. I think I even tell my children, like, yes, money is great, but oh my gosh, the value of doing something where you feel like you're making a difference is immeasurable. And so really understanding what are those things that drive you, what are those things that you're passionate about, whether it's being in a lab, whether it's being on the ground, try and figure that out and use different experiences to kind of tease out what really drives you. I'd also say, don't put yourself in a box. Don't let other people or institutions put you in a box. So if you feel like, there are other ways that you can express your talents and gifts, take advantage of those opportunities. Like, this world is so different. You're not going to be working for the same company for 30 or 40 years, most likely. Maybe there might be some cases, but that's just so different now. I think getting practical experience has been so critical. So whether it's through a co-op or an internship, or just reaching out to someone and saying like, hey, I want to, shadow you and learn what you do and figure out if this is something for me, I think is so important. I don't think any experience is a bad experience. You learn from the good jobs and the bad jobs, and the good internships and the bad internships. So I say, in this world, anything is possible. And the reason that I've kind of stepped out of an institution to start my own thing is because I want to be able to create the space and reimagine the work that I can do. And you have the ability to do that. So I would just say, again, to Katie's point, believe in yourself, dispel stereotypes, don't let people put you in a box, and take advantage of all opportunities that you can. And you will get to your divinely appointed place. It might not be the path of someone else. It might be a little here and there, but that's okay. So I just encourage you to really follow your passion.
Well, thanks everyone for those very insightful answers, very helpful. We kind of went over number 5, like you all sort of discussed what skills are important. It sounds like communication, as well as sort of being willing to branch out and try a variety of things and diversify sort of your experience. So I guess we'll move on to the audience questions. And as a reminder, if you have anyone in the audience has a question, please send them to Hector and Savannah through the chat, and they'll send them over to me and Chelsea.
Okay, so getting into our first question. The first question is, we all acknowledge some of the reasons that are contributing towards deterioration of the environment, for example, plastics and burning fossil fuels, etc. So why is government not banning plastics altogether? And why do you think government agencies do not bring more strict regulations for burning fossil fuels?
Start with a hard one, eh? Whew. I'm not sure exactly how to answer that, except for that I think that these issues are really big and complex, and governments are, you know, it takes a long time to make change and get movement. And so I think as individuals that are concerned about these issues and passionate about these issues, it's important to think about the steps that lead to the bigger change that we're looking for and celebrate in those as well. In Canada, there's been legislation been in the pipeline anyway about plastics, which is really positive. But of course, yeah, we're a long way to go. And so, yeah, I'm not sure exactly what else to say. I'd be interested to hear what other panelists have to say.
Yeah,
Question.
Oh, go ahead, Donna. Go ahead.
Okay. I go back to my question, who benefits? We have the fossil fuel industry, you have the coal industry, you have the oil industry, you have unions, you have, you know, what is it, ALEC, which is the consortium of businesses or rich people who invest in this lobbying group to control politicians, and politicians are more likely to act on behalf of these lobbies than they are on behalf of individuals or even sciences. So I think that's when politicians like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders say you've got to get money out of the political campaigning and out of government, because whenever you have big moneyed interests, they're going to control things. When Joe Biden was running, he had to backtrack on even talking about fracking, because people in Pennsylvania, he might have lost Pennsylvania if he said he didn't believe in fracking. And then they get the workers, you know, scared. Wait a minute, what about jobs? And even though you could say there's green jobs, there's not a green jobs lobby that's going to fight for green jobs in the same way, and certainly not in the state of Pennsylvania. And because we have these electoral politics the way that we are, we need these electors, right? And so we could lose a whole state. If we lose a whole state, you can't be president. And that's the way our government currently is making decisions right now. And if we want decisions to be made on a different basis, we've got to you know, really fight for campaign reform. It's not sexy and it's not directly tied to science, but it is directly tied to why our government is anti-science.
And I'll say too, at the other end is it's individuals too, right? I was watching an episode of Shark Tank one time, and there were 2 pitches for things that might actually change the world, that might actually have a benefit. And they were like, yeah, you know what, that's too hard. People aren't going to want to buy these things that are good for the environment, that are actually going to change how we do things and have a smaller footprint. And instead they funded a very specifically sized plastic thing to hold your submarine sandwich in so that it won't get wet when you're fishing, because that's what people want to buy. Right. So it's right down to that, like, what are our consumers purchasing when we, you know, you go to the dollar store and everything is throwaway and people want that convenience. So if we have to, yes, we have to change, things at the policy level, but we also have to change, we have to be willing to change how we live our lives, and that we have to say, no, it is, we will give up that convenience of the single-use plastic and, these other things and make change. We'll ride our bikes more. We'll live in walkable communities. We have to be willing to make those changes as well.
But those changes also get impacted by policy. We could decide we don't want plastic straws, right? And if we decided that, we wouldn't base it on consumer preference, we would base it on public policy. To a certain extent, when our public policy doesn't control for things, consumers may want to smoke cigarettes, and so we have anti-smoking campaigns. Consumers may want to do all types of things that we decide are socially bad, and therefore we change thinking. Consumerism is also a big part of our culture. We are constantly being marketed. So I think that I'm not going to assume that we don't have any control, because of course we have control on the individual level, but I also think that we respond to recycling campaigns, for example. You have nations where people can't not recycle because it's against the law and they'll be ticketed. I believe I was told that in Germany, you've got to recycle. Here we leave it up to preference. And that's where I think we get into trouble.
Yeah, I mean, a lot. Yeah, the only thing that I would add is that we have to incentivize the behaviors that we want to see. And if you look at most of the products, I'm sitting here looking at my desk, from my laptop to my comb to my, my glass, like in terms of plastics and all of, just think about plastics and all the things that they're in. and so how do we begin, when you talk about, again, like plastics and coal-fired power plants, whatever, how do we begin to incentivize behaviors that get us away from the stuff that's actually making it hard for our earth to be sustainable? And one of the activities that I do with my students, I'm a professor at George Washington University. We do this this calculator. I mean, there's a bunch of calculators out here, but this one is around like how much in the way I'm living, how many earths am I actually depleting by the way that I'm living? And when you think about that, it's like really doing this life cycle analysis of, where I get my groceries, where I get my energy, how big is my home, all these different pieces. And I think until we look at like holistically how much we are dependent on petroleum and fossil fuels and how much that permeates all these different aspects of our society, until we begin to incentivize ways to get beyond petroleum, energy efficiency, like really incentivize it and really hit the bottom lines of some of these industries, we're going to continue to be asking the same question 10 or 15 years from now. And so I think that part of it, we need to change what we say is a good thing. And we need to hit the bottom line of a lot of these companies that are producing things that aren't good. And then I think to Katie's point, definitely, and I will just speak for myself, but I feel like the US in particular, we are very wasteful. Not everybody, but in general, when you compare us to other countries. So how do we as a society, not only shift our individual behaviors, which again will add up collectively to some good, but how do we begin to, kind of shift our cultural behaviors? Like it's bigger than us. So I think those are kind of it's not easy, but I think it's possible. But we got to look at like, what is the root of all of our problems? Consumerism, depletion of resources, and how do we incentivize the behaviors that we want to see?
Well, thanks everyone for that. Oh, you have a addition?
No, I'll pass on that.
Oh, okay. Are you sure?
I guess the last thing is, it's not easy. It's not just switching. Maybe sometimes it is. Just banning plastics, or just, the example of Joe Biden in Pennsylvania, the fracking, there's still individuals that are impacted. Somebody might have a fracking job today and the promise of a green job someplace down the road may come, may never come. And so it's just the complexities of all these decisions. And I believe that power sits in some concentrated places at the moment, and how to distribute that, and have people be able to meet their needs. We have some underlying needs that need to be met on many of these things. So that's very ambiguous, but it's just not simple, and it gets scary and nervous and so big to worry about. But sometimes you just got to tackle them head on.
Well, thank you. Our next question comes from Dr. Anna Bogehold. Hopefully I pronounced that right. She said, Donna Givens is an excellent addition to this panel. She's great. I do have a question for the panel though. What can scientific researchers do to better complement nonprofits? And what do panelists want from scientists at universities and the government? Basically, how can we help facilitate change with nonprofits or even social enterprises?
I'll start. You know, I came from a very traditional theoretical ecology program. Much of the science, maybe I'm being too broad of a brush, but I think a lot of the science that's being produced just doesn't help solve problems. And people think, you know, when you're writing that science proposal and sending it to NSF or sending it to whatever funding agency, you have this little collaboration or application chunk that's always at the end of the proposal, and they kind of put language in there. It's like, oh, this will help with something. No, you got to go to the organizations like Katie or Donna have and say, what's the information you really need to do to advance a strategy or an idea, and start from there, and not start from the idea that an individual that loves being a scientist has and thinks it might have some application, but maybe start from the other side of the ledger and say, and so when I look internally, like, what's the information I really need? It's a different set of information. I do not mean to devalue the basic theoretical information in scientists that people work on. We 100% need that, and I'm glad there are public funding agencies like NSF that absolutely do that. But that's multiple steps away from the types of decisions that get made every day about people's health and well-being and nature. There's a gap there, and trying to translate across that gap it's many steps and it's pretty different. So my suggestion would be really start by asking the folks who are in the places doing the work every day what information will advance. That's my soapbox. Thank you.
So I kind of came at from both sides. When I was doing my grad work, I was partnered with conservation authorities. So I was, you know, it was always important to me, like, yes, that theoretical science is very important, and I'm happy that somebody does it, but it's not what drives me. So it was always, I always needed to do science that would help us to advance policy or would help us to advance on the ground understanding. So when I did my graduate work, I partnered with conservation authorities, and I had I thought I was going to be a professor. And that when I was a professor, that I would partner with my local conservation authority, and I would build my research program around the needs of a conservation authority and the type of research that they need done. I'm not a prolific publisher, and that idea of publisher perish and that pressure of an academic setting was not for me. And I ended up on the other side of the table, where instead I'm at a conservation authority with numerous research partners who are willing to listen and who are interested in doing that on the ground type work, that more applicable science, where they come to us and say, you know, here's an idea, this is what our research program is, where does it fit? And it still can be hard for us sometimes to find someone that's willing to do the work that we need, that will help us to actually like protect the environment right now, because research takes a long time and a graduate program takes a long time. You have to analyze your research, you have to publish your research. And sometimes an NGO needs information faster than a graduate project can be. So it can be hard to strike that balance. But I think, you know, just building those partnerships and listening to whatever organization is around you and the needs that they have for research, and being willing to do that applied research.
If no one else has any more comments on that question, we can move on to the next one. So our next question is, why don't we just train environment supporters to be the leaders and decision makers?
think the answer is we should. Like, I hope that the politicians that I support are ones that are knowledgeable on the environment, or health or social issues. You know, when I have politicians that come to my door because they're campaigning, I ask them, what do you know about these issues? What are your stance on these issues? And I think that it's really important that we start putting people in decision-making positions that come from multiple backgrounds, and have multiple sets of experiences. And I think that that's also why, you know, as a student who's maybe doing a degree in ecology, maybe you'll end up in politics, and that would be great. That would be great, because it takes those kinds of decision makers with, you know, that kind of multiple experience, I think, to make the change that we're all talking about here today. One of the things, when I was with the World Wildlife Fund, there was a lot of internal discussion about whether we work with industry, and like big industry like Coca-Cola, and or whether we don't. So are we pushing against them, or are we trying to kind of work within them and make change? And different NGOs will make decisions in different ways for different reasons, but WWF at the time decided that they would work with industry and try and get people within that sector who have, you know, the different experiences and skill sets and interests that could drive their agenda forward. And I think, you know, that was an interesting decision and a good decision. And I think that, you know, you may find yourselves in multiple roles over your career. And if you bring your experience from graduate school with you, then that is going to make your decision-making better.
And if we're, you know, we do education programs with young people, and we teach recycling, and we teach all these things, but we need to carry that forward. We're learning about the environment and our role in it and our impact on it should be part of that sort of core learning, right? And we have a grade 9 in our house, and he's, you know, he's learning about the Conservation Authority, and he's, you know, doing these things, and I'm like, that's awesome. And I'm really glad that that's happening, because no matter what you do in your career, if you're a business person, if you're an engineer, like, you still need to have that basic understanding of the actions that I take on the ground have an impact on the environment around me. So if we can even just get that basic concept in, then every person that we have in office has that basic understanding, right? And I will say, being someone that works in an NGO, I write policies for source water protection. I'm a scientist. I have no idea how to write a policy. So when, you know, someone said this is your job, I have to learn how to write a policy. We also were governed under the Conservation Authorities Act, and the work I do with source water is under the Clean Water Act. So I have to learn how to read policy and how to interpret policy. So this is another important skill in it. And it's, you know, that ability to learn and just keep learning in your life is super important. And know that even though you're doing science now, doesn't mean you won't do policy later.
I think that we have to be honest, though, about how decisions get made. I think it was Jamie Dimon tried to change the decision-making process for JP Morgan Chase and say, we've got to care about more than our investors. We've got to care about our impact on the world, or something like that. And the investors came back and said, nope, it's got to be about the investment, right? So I think when we look at how decisions get made, and even when people have knowledge and even people have good ideas, they don't always have the power to implement them, because we're talking about systems and not people. And I can be knowledgeable about something and not change a system. We've got to look at systems change as a big part of the process, because enlightened individuals will not change how our country functions on a large scale. I also think we have to look at cross-training people, that when people are learning about environmental science, they also have to learn about people. They also have to learn about equity and racial justice and gender equality if they're going to be effective advocates to really get at some of these issues. I am, you know, really honored to teach a class right now at Columbia University in sustainability management on race equity. And it is the class on race equity, urban race equity in the school. So the students actually said, we need opportunities to learn these things when we're being trained in sustainability management, because I think also we can be so hyper-focused on the environment that we don't look at the intersection between the environment and the people in our community.
Just one thing, if I could build on that, I right out of college, I worked with spent a year volunteering with a social service organization. They had a tagline of being ruined for life. And I was ruined for life by some ideas because they're always present with me. And so, you know, now I help oversee an internship program we have with MSU Law and between the Nature Conservancy and MSU Law. I am more than happy. I hope those lawyers don't enter the environmental field. I hope they're in contracts or finance or something. I hope they're in corporate law. I hope they're somewhere else, but that they are kind of have that conservation chip on their shoulder and the back of their mind. I don't want them all to come work for Nature Conservancy. We do hire some wonderful lawyers and I love working with them, but I would rather them go elsewhere. And I think Donna probably sees the same thing about the students coming to her class. But yeah, let's bring some in to our worlds, but let's hope the others go out and they're ruined for life by an ethic, a conservation ethic, a social service ethic. So yeah, I'm very happy when they go the other direction. We need to be represented in all those decision-making avenues.
Yeah, the only other thing that I would add is that, my goodness, I think it's so important in thinking about my girls, like, you know, building that pipeline is super important, but we also have to realize and recognize that we have folks that are in positions now that are career staff in some places, in some agencies that are making decisions right now that need that education or, you know, kind of that understanding of that connecting the dots, whatever. And so how do we begin to also, you know, maybe as graduate students or, you know, postdocs begin to, you know, what is that pathway for education for these folks that are in these positions now, that are making decisions that might not be leaving their positions anytime soon, but have the power and the privilege to shape them things that can really be a benefit to society or not. And so I think that is sometimes the missing piece and maybe an opportunity for graduate students or others that are interested in kind of like moving the ball and kind of making change. I also think that it's super important that we, I like to say, kind of make friends in places where we might not have friends. And I remember having a conversation with an organization. I was heavily involved with the National Society of Black Engineers about environmental justice and sustainability a long time ago. And that was just, it wasn't exciting for them because, again, it's a lot of industry. And, you know, again, industry oftentimes does not really put people first. But I think, you know, we're at this kind of inflection point in our society where we can begin to kind of bring these conversations of sustainability and equity and justice and environmental stewardship into these spaces that we weren't able to before. And so I think, again, where, you know, whatever your training is or your, you know, as you go into whatever facet you decide, you know, take this with you and just begin to interject and ask questions and disrupt in a good way. Like that's what it's about. And I think, you know, I don't know, like, I feel like I'm always learning. And even as I think about my students, I have students in their 20s, I have some students in their 50s and 60s, but the fact is that they're there to learn and kind of enhance their experience or, you know, and how they can actually, again, just begin to make a better, meaningful contribution to society and in what this whole environmental health stuff means. So I think there's always room for learning. There's always room to make new friends, and there's always room to kind of help educate those that are in positions of power and privilege now so they can, again, make good decisions.
Well, thank you everyone for your thoughts. We do have some questions left. However, we can just send them in a Google Doc and you all can answer on your own. But yeah, I think we're gonna wrap up because we had an amazing discussion and we covered so many different areas. Me and Chelsea really didn't have to do that much work. You all were like amazing. And So before we wrap up, I just want to tell the audience just a few things. So we do have a panel discussion again on February 26th. It's actually covering environmental sustainability with industry, with speakers in the industry. And so that will be at 10 a.m. if you all can join us there. And thank you to the audience for joining us, and we will try to get those questions answered, as well as if you need contact information, we can certainly ask the panelists if they're willing to share their contacts, and we can get you in touch with them.